Hello everyone, I am Demented Kirby, and welcome to my channel, the Commander Tavern. The Commander Tavern is a channel dedicated to my favorite Magic the Gathering format. The Brewery is a series on this channel showcasing my spicy brews and other deck techs. On this episode of The Brewery, I will be discussing my take on Ramos Dragon Engine. If you like this deck, or any of the cards I'll be mentioning throughout the video, please consider using my TCG Player affiliate link when purchasing those cards. You can find that link down in the description. It'll really help out the channel. Other ways you can help support the channel is with my Patreon. Higher tier patrons get access to my Discord server as well as early access to scheduled videos on YouTube. You can find a link to that down in the description as well. In fact, patrons got a chance to see this video earlier. Alright, let's get back to the episode. Ramos is a 4/4 artifact creature dragon with flying for 6 generic. Whenever you cast a spell, it gets a +1/+1 counter for each of its colors. This is why, with the exception of only 6 cards, every spell in the deck is multicolored. Those 6 exceptions we'll see soon enough, but this ability is amazing. That means that if you cast a handful of multicolored spells, Ramos could potentially have the power to one-shot someone with commander damage, or at the very least be a 2-turn clock. However, this ability makes no sense since Ramos is colorless. However, its second ability is what gives it its Wooburg color identity. When you remove 5 +1/+1 counters from it, it adds 2 mana of every color to your mana pool. That's crazy. That just helps us cast even more multicolored spells to make it even larger. Unfortunately, we can only use this once per turn. This is why the deck runs Vedalken Orrery, one of the 6 colorless spells in the deck just mentioned. We can also use Ramos' ability each turn with Alchemist's Refuge. Giving our spells flash is crucial in the deck because we want to take the most advantage of his mana ability as possible, since without them, we have to wait until our own turn to use that mana. Since we don't want to make Ramos weaker by taking counters away to cast spells, we want those spells to give him as many +1/+1 counters as possible. This makes Ramos a built-in beater as well as a flying mana factory. Therefore, I propose to brew a deck using as many multicolored spells as possible. 3 of the other colorless spells in the deck are Mana Crypt, Mana Vault, and Soul Ring. Since Ramos can be cast with mana of any color, having these mana rocks allows us to cast Ramos as quickly as possible in order to take advantage of the other multicolored spells we'll be casting. The other colorless mana source in the deck is Ancient Tomb. These colorless sources aren't very helpful apart from casting Ramos, but some of the spells in the deck do have generic costs, so they're still helpful. Even so, the deck shouldn't depend on Ramos for its mana ability. That's why it's also running Feyburrow Elder. On its own, this poor man's Bloom Tender can tap for green and white. However, since the deck has so many multicolored permanents, it can very easily tap down for Wooburg. As a bonus, it also has the potential of being a 5/5 with Vigilance. We can also bypass having to cast spells altogether. The deck runs Maelstrom Angel. If it's able to hit an opponent, we can cast a non-land spell from our hand for free. And if Ramos just happens to be out, casting the Angel gives it 5 +1/+1 counters. Whatever we cast for free off the Angel will also give Ramos +1/+1 counters. Similarly, we can also cheat spells with Golos Tireless Pilgrim. The 5th colorless card of those mentioned, at least it has a color identity of Wooburg. Golos ramps when it enters the battlefield, but we can also sink 7 mana into it in order to exile the top 3 cards of our library and potentially cheat all 3 of them. What's great about Golos is that we can use Ramos' ability to pay for it each turn. Then whatever we cast for free off of Golos will give Ramos more +1/+1 counters that can be used to pay for its ability in the following turn. When left unanswered, this can be incredibly oppressive since you can potentially do this on each of your opponent's turns as well as your own. Fortunately, these 3 cards work well on their own. That being said, we do want to capitalize on Ramos' ability. This is why the deck is running Vorel of the Hullclade. When we activate him, we can double the +1/+1 counters on Ramos, which really goes a long way with the minimum investment in mana. Either way, doubling the +1/+1 counters on Ramos is also an excellent way to take out an opponent if we swing in with Ramos. Another way to get some +1/+1 counters on Ramos is with Abzan Charm and Jund Charm. When cast, they put 3 +1/+1 counters on Ramos. Then when they resolve, if you choose the final mode for either of them, they put 2 more +1/+1 counters on Ramos. Essentially, for 3 mana, these spells put 5 +1/+1 counters on Ramos, which is enough to then provide 2 mana of each color. So in this deck, these spells are effectively the most epic rituals possible. Besides Vorel and the charms, the deck does have other ways of playing around with Ramos' +1/+1 counters. The deck runs Atraxa Praetor's Voice. She's a 4-colored, so she'll give Ramos +1/+1 counters just on being cast. Then, at the end of the turn, she proliferates, giving it that 5th +1/+1 counter. If that weren't enough, she's a 4/4 with Flying, Vigilance, Death Touch, and Lifelink. this makes her quite the formidable creature on the battlefield as well. However, we don't have to really worry about artificially putting +1/+1 counters on Ramos because, as I mentioned earlier, 89% of the spells in the deck are multicolored. This means that whatever spell we cast as a response or for support will pump Ramos as a bonus. So keeping all our spells gold is incredibly beneficial and synergistic. As far as support goes, Ramos is very important to the deck. That's why I've included Dauntless Escort, Boros Charm, and the ready half of Ready and Willing. These multicolored spells help to give our board indestructible. Apart from these three, I'm also running Loxodon Hierarch and Golgari Charm in order to regenerate all my creatures. This won't help against Wrath of God or Damnation, but it will against most other Wraths or lethal damage. Dragonlord Dromoka prevents opponents from casting spells during our turn. This is great for when we're about to go off or to prevent them from casting anything while we enter combat with a huge Ramos. It's also helpful against counter magic. On that note, Surak Dragonclaw is included for that same reason. Not only does he prevent our creatures from being countered, but he gives trample to our other creatures. If that weren't enough, he himself can't be countered and he has built-in flash, so we can cast him in any turn. Yet, if we still fall to our opponent's responses, it's not the end of the world. The deck runs Muldrotha the Gravetide in order to be able to cast permanents from our graveyard. We can also use her to replay fetch lands. Obzadot's Aid also helps us in that respect. It allows us to reanimate any permanent in our graveyard for just 5 mana. We can also recover things to our hand using Reborn Hope and Reap the Past. Reborn Hope can only get 1 card, but that's fine since most cards in the deck are multicolored. This is great for reusing instants and sorceries too. Reap the Past is crazy good since it returns X cards chosen at random. If X is big enough, we can recover the entire graveyard. Using this off of Ramos' ability alone gets us 8 cards at random back from the graveyard. That's nothing to scoff at. Similar to Maelstrom Angel, your Tiller Nephilim helps us cheat things into play. The difference being that the Nephilim doesn't need to successfully hit an opponent since it triggers on attack. Also, the creature reanimated is also tapped and attacking. However, it's still best to prevent losing our things altogether. Marquesa of the Black Rose returns creatures to the battlefield. The caveat is that she's limited only to creatures with a +1/+1 counter on them, which is fine as far as Ramos is concerned. But she does give all of our creatures dethrone, so it is possible for them to get a +1/+1 counter on them before dying. Another way to recover dying creatures is with Rian, Angel of Rebirth. Unlike Marquesa, Rian returns the creatures to our hand. The creatures have to be multicolored, which is fine in this deck, except for Ramos and Golos. What's great about the creatures returning to our hand is that we can recast them afterwards in order to give Ramos more +1/+1 counters. So even though it's not as oppressive as Marquesa's ability, we can still take advantage of it for Ramos. And what about disruption and removal of our own? We have plenty of spells for that too. Deputy of Detention and the Tension Sphere each exile a non-land permanent when they enter the battlefield until they leave. They're cheap to cast and can deal with almost any problem on the board. Anguished Unmaking, Assassin's Trophy, and Utter End can also get rid of almost any problem, especially Assassin's Trophy since it can also destroy lands. What's great about these is that they're relatively cheap to cast and can be done so at instant speed. Dispark can also get rid of any permanent at instant speed, but it's limited to those costing 4 mana or greater. That's not such a drawback since most permanents in Commander games are pretty hefty in casting cost. Maelstrom Pulse and Vindicate can both get rid of any problem as well, but at sorcery speed. Vindicate can also target lands, unlike Maelstrom Pulse. However, the Pulse can also get rid of other permanents with the same name. When facing against a token deck, this can be incredibly brutal. Bedevil is a great instance since it can target artifacts, creatures, or planeswalkers, which are some of the most common permanents in Commander games. So you'll definitely find something to destroy with that. Oh, and at instant speed too. Casualties of War and Decimate are able to target multiple types of permanents, which is amazing in multiplayer games. This allows you to get rid of multiple nuisances from a single player or more. Crackling Doom can also get rid of multiple things, but it has opponents sacrifice them, which is better than just destroying them. It doesn't target either, which bypasses opponents with Shroud or Hexproof. And at instant speed too. What's great about these spells is that they can be copied with Riku of 2 Reflections. For just 2 more mana, Riku will duplicate these spells, making them even more brutal. He can also duplicate creatures. This helps with doubling up on creatures like Deputy of Detention, as well as the previously mentioned Dauntless Escort and Loxodon Hierarch. Since Maelstrom Angel isn't legendary, he can copy that also. Riku's just great in the deck, especially since he's 3-colored. However, he might not be enough if we need to take care of the entire table. But that's what Dune Blast and Supreme Verdict are for. While these serve to destroy all creatures, we can at least keep Ramos on the field with Dune Blast. The deck does have reusable ways to get rid of things too. Aura Shards helps destroy an artifact or enchantment whenever a creature enters the battlefield on our side. We can also use Oko Thief of Crowns to get rid of an artifact or creature every turn by turning them into a 3/3 elk. Since they're not destroyed, it bypasses indestructible. It's also a great way to get rid of commanders. We can also steal creatures if we can't get rid of them. Marieki Rebirth can tap to control any creature while she's tapped and or on the battlefield. If not, the creature is destroyed. This is also a great way to get rid of commanders since it be under our control. We can also disrupt opponents by countering their things. Azoria's Guild Mage is great because it can counter activated abilities. This is something more players should be doing. For just 3 mana, we can counter abilities from Planeswalkers as well as tapping abilities, etc. Anything that isn't a mana ability gets countered. This shuts down a lot of decks and strategies, and it doesn't even need to be tapped down to do so. We can also tap down a creature for 3 mana. This is great in response to an opponent's attack step. Just tap down their fatty or commander before they assign them as an attacker, and you're safe from its attack. Another way to deal with opponents' responses is to prevent them from tutoring for them. Ashiok Dreamrender prevents opponents from looking through their libraries. That way they can't find answers to our things. It also prevents them from ramping, so that's a plus too. As another plus, it can also exile all opponents' graveyards, so it also shuts down graveyard strategies. Another way to do that is with Anaffenza the Foremost. If a creature would go into opponent's graveyard from anywhere, it's exiled instead. That means that it's exiled even if it's milled or discarded. As a bonus, Anaffenza can also add a +1/+1 counters. So if we're also attacking with Ramos, it gets a +1/+1 counter. Yet, in order to have all these responses ready, we need to be able to dig through our deck. Chulainn, Teller of Tales is an excellent card for this deck. Every time we cast a creature, we draw a card and play a land. With 27 creatures in the deck, this can definitely trigger every now and again. If that weren't enough, he has a built-in ability to bounce one of our creatures back. This is great since we can recast a creature with a lot of colors in order to also trigger Ramos. Joyder, Weatherlight Captain, can also draw us cards on cast triggers. She triggers whenever we cast a historic spell. There's 27 historic spells in the deck, so she'll definitely trigger every now and again also. Damia, Sage of Stone, can also help with drawing cards. Although you skip your draw step, you can draw up to 7 cards at the beginning of your upkeep. That's usually the case since this deck generates a ton of mana and is constantly casting spells. She also has Death Touch as a bonus in case you really need a chump blocker. The deck also has ways to draw massive amounts of cards at once. Prime Speaker Zagana has the potential of drawing a ridiculous amount of cards when she enters the battlefield, as well as being incredibly huge. She might not have any built-in evasion, but she's definitely intimidating. She can also be bounced back with Chulainn in order to get even more value out of her. Sphinx's Revelation is also a great way to draw a ton of cards. With Ramos' ability alone, we draw 7 cards and gain 7 life as a bonus. Since it has X in its cost, we can essentially sink as much as we want into it. The deck also has ways to just straight up tutor for things. Bring to Light could be paid with Wooburg in order to tutor for any 5-costed spell and cast it for free. That's nothing to scoff at, especially since doing so with a spell that costs Wooburg will once more give Ramos 5 more +1/+1 counters. When we cast the demand half of Supply and Demand, we can tutor for any multicolored spell in the deck. Recall that 89% of all spells in the deck are multicolored, so it's an amazing tutor here. You can also tutor for any creature in the deck thanks to Momor Vig Simic Visionary. Apart from Golos, every single creature in the deck is either green or blue. That means that every creature we'll cast will trigger him one way or the other. There's also plenty of creatures that are both colors, so it triggers both of his abilities, putting that tutored creature directly into your hand. Or you can tutor up 5 different spells with Conflux. When you look for cards with Conflux, you can choose which one is your white spell, blue spell, etc. So as long as you assign one color to each of those multicolored spells, you can tutor for 5 different cards with it. And what are some of the things we can tutor for? Well, any of the win cons or cards that facilitate a victory. Door to Nothingness, the last colorless spell in the deck, spells Impending Doom for any hapless opponent. Sure, it enters the battlefield tapped, but once untapped, 1 Ramos activation and it's all over for someone. If no one has a response to it, you can definitely use it for tyrannical politics using fear to incentivize. You can also tutor for Magister Sphinx and Progenitus. Ramos makes it very easy to cast Progenitus that will give Ramos back those +1/+1 counters used to cast it. Magister Sphinx puts an opponent's life within range to die to Progenitus, which is incredibly difficult to deal with since it has protection from everything. We can also make Ramos even more dangerous in order to guarantee that commander damage win with Chromanticore. Attaching Chromanticore as an aura gives Ramos +4/+4, First Strike, Vigilance, Trample, and Lifelink. Even if Ramos has no +1/+1 counters on it, casting Chromaticor gives it 5 +1/+1 counters, giving it a total power and toughness of 13/13. And that's assuming that Ramos had no previous counters on it. Chromaticor is an epic aura to make Ramos incredibly dangerous. Then, if Ramos were to leave the battlefield for any reason, Chromaticor becomes a creature. Saskia the Unyielding makes beatdown even easier. Any combat damage we do to one opponent is done to another. This is amazing against players with Pillow Fort or control effects. We can just hit the opponent without defenses in order to take out that one. Saskia is still great on her own because she's a 3/4 with Vigilance and Haste for just 4 mana. Then, if you eliminate a player and want to get the other one, you can by bouncing her with Chulainn. The other win cons in the deck aren't combat oriented, so they're harder to deal with. Mael's Aria can very easily be an Oops I Win card since it's not that hard to make Ramos huge, especially with help from cards like Vorrel of the Hallclade. Speaking of which, Simic Ascendancy is another win con in the deck. Not only can we sink extra mana in it in order to give Ramos more +1/+1 counters, but every time Ramos or any of our creatures get one, it gets its own counter. Then, if at the beginning of your upkeep, it has 20 of those growth counters, you win the game. So if you find yourself in a sort of stalemate, you can still win the game with these 2 enchantments. The rest of the deck is just lands. The deck's running all 11 fetch lands, all 10 dual lands, all 10 shock lands, as well as 1 snow basic land of each type in case opponents have anything that benefits us for it. Obviously, this makes the deck impossibly expensive if we don't already have these cards. However, the deck can still be built with a more modest mana base and still run incredibly well. You can run all 10 Pain lands, lands that give mana of any color like Command Tower, City of Brass, Mana Confluence, etc., as well as more basic lands. You can also run Guild Gates and use Maze's End as a potential win con. Ramos produces so much mana that all you really need to do is have the necessary mana to cast a couple of spells in order to give it enough +1/+1 counters to cast anything you would otherwise be unable to. Same goes for the expensive mana rocks. You can pull this off with Arcane Signet, Felwar Stone, etc. I suggest these cards because I already have them and lots of other players do as well. That being said, I am aware that most people don't, which is why I don't brew with incredibly expensive cards. The mana base is the only exception, since these are cards that can be swapped out with no detriment to the spirit of the deck nor the strategies therein. Either way, having a stable and reliable mana base for 5-colored decks is no easy feat, and if you don't want to use non-land slots for ramp or fixing, you have to rely on your lands. This brew is just an idea of how to build around Ramos' Dragon Engine. As I mentioned throughout the video, I wanted this deck to be limited to running as many multicolored spells as possible. The deck definitely isn't too oppressive or competitive, but even with this self-imposed challenge, it can go toe-to-toe in a semi-competitive pod. With less oppressive cards and a cheaper mana base, it could completely compose of only gold spells and be played in janky, casual, or even focus pods. But as is, this deck is a lot of fun to pilot and play. If you're interested in the deck list of this spicy brew of mine, you can find a link to it down in the description. I would like to thank all my patrons for supporting me, and a quick shout out to all my higher tier patrons, the brewers, for their patronage. I'd also like to thank anyone using my TCG Player affiliate link. That also helps out the channel. And apologies for my voice, I am incredibly sick. I have a throat infection, so hopefully I've been able to be understandable throughout this video. And to everyone, thanks for watching this episode of The Brewery on the Commander Tavern. I am Demented Kirby, and happy brewing.